Everyone, my name is Daniela Bleichmar. I direct the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC. Thank you so much for joining us. I do want to ask that if you're able to turn on your Zoom camera, you do so. It is so much nicer for this conversation to see friends and colleagues rather than names and still photos. Wow, there they all go. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about Roberto Diaz's new book, Latin America and the Transports of Opera, Fragments of a Transatlantic Discourse, out from Vanderbilt University Press this year. And I have to show the beautiful cover. Joining us in this conversation with Roberto are Michelle Clayton, who is Associate Professor of Hispanic Studies and Comparative Literature at Brown University, and Gustavo Pérez Firmat, who is a David Feinson Professor Emeritus of Humanities at Columbia University. And the conversation will be moderated by our colleague at USC, Natania Meeker, Associate Professor of French and Comparative Literature. Today's book chat is organized in partnership with the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures at USC and the Department of Comparative Literature. Our program is quite simple. We will start with a very brief introduction to the book by Roberto, and then we will have roughly 35 or 40 minutes for conversation between Roberto, Michelle, and Gustavo. And we will have roughly the last 15 minutes for questions from participants. We will let you know when we are ready for those questions and ask you to use your Zoom hand to indicate that you have one so that you can ask it to Roberto himself. So many congratulations on your book, Roberto, and please tell us about it.
Thank you, Daniela. And I'd like to start by thanking you for inviting me to do this book chat, as well as to Zach at the Levan Institute, who has been so helpful with all of the logistics, etc. And also to all of you who are here, because it's a fabulous sort of space-time continuum of my entire life. From, colleagues here at USC and across town at UCLA and in other parts of the country. I see people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in San Francisco, and in Chicago. Thank you, Lucille, who have been so wonderful for me. And in Spain, or maybe it's Norway. I don't know. Anyway, it's really in Madrid. So thank you all for being here. I would just like to organize my short remarks along three words. The first word is passion. The second word is corpus, or body, if you wish. And the third one is book, simply sort of to organize my thoughts, because I could go on and talk about this book forever. It has more than 400 pages. And I also would like to thank Vanderbilt University Press for agreeing to publish such a long book. I think it's just, se me fue la mano, as we say in Spanish. I went overboard. The idea behind passion is, of course, opera is an art form that is often associated with passion and with the etymology of passion, of course, which is to suffer. And I did suffer a lot when I was writing this book, but I want to focus now on the passion that I felt when I decided that I wanted to start writing about opera. And it had to do with, actually, it goes back to a conversation that I had with a former professor, Enrique Anderson Imbert, in Buenos Aires, and I could talk about that particular conversation for hours, but suffice it to say that he advised me as I was beginning to write my dissertation that I should only write on things that I felt passionate about, things that I loved. And this is at the end of the 20th century when I became passionate about opera. And I had gotten tenure at USC, which meant that I had a bit more freedom to organize my research. And I said, well, what can I say about opera if I like it so much? And of course, there were some difficulties. The first one is that opera is essentially a musical genre, and I'm not a musicologist. But luckily, also, opera, as you know, is a verbal formation, and I fancied myself as a literary scholar. So I said to myself, what can I write about the words of opera? And it's always been a big controversy about what comes first in opera, words or music, la musica o le parole. And I said, well, in my case, it's going to have to be the parole, the words, because I really don't have the training to say anything about the music, except to quote what musicologists have said. And I'm very thankful to see Louise Stein here, joining us from Ann Arbor, I think, whose work was actually fundamental for me, because one of the things that I enjoyed about writing about this new subject was that I was beginning to learn about a new canon. And fortunately, the operatic canon is far more limited if one views it from a certain angle than the canons of literature, which are interminable. And the scholarship about opera in Latin America, or in the case of Luis, more broadly, the Spanish Atlantic world, was somehow more manageable than what I thought was happening in literary studies, where it became also very theoretical, and so on and so forth. So anyway, from my passion, I decided that I understood that I needed to come up with a corpus, and I started focusing on three specific things. Number one, um, Latin American literature and its engagement with opera, novels, short stories, even essays that dealt with opera in the context of literature. Also, Latin American operas, which was sort of a new field for me and a difficult field to learn about, because Latin American opera is underrepresented in the international repertoire. And lastly, European and sometimes American operas about what we now call Latin America, going back to the colonial era into the present. So I decided to really consider those three large bodies, and chapters 1 and chapter 2 of the book deal with them. I'm not a historian of anything, so I could not really write a history of any of these three bodies, but I decided, perhaps with some risks, to come up with concise narratives of these three different formations, and you'll be the judge of that, how well it went or not. And lastly, I conceived the book into 8 chapters, and the chapters kept growing without really my realizing it, and they kept shifting positions. So for example, chapter 8, which deals with the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires, was actually the beginning of the book. That's how I started writing the book, with a description of the opening night at the Colón in 1908, and its performance of Verdi's Aida, which I was really interested in because it's also the opera that Verdi wrote for the Opera House in Cairo, which has in turn created a lot of interest in post-colonial literature, starting with, of course, Edward Said, etc. And then 6 more chapters, and each of these 6 chapters is a bit of a case study. I don't really think I have time to describe any of them in any specificity. Perhaps we will come to some of them as we chat. But one last thing that I do want to say is that besides writing about libretti, that is to say, the words of opera, and besides writing about literature that engages with opera, I started discovering other interesting convergences of opera with Latin America. One of the first things that I discovered, which I now think is more of an urban legend than a real thing, is the supposed origin of the Cuban national anthem in an aria from Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro. So I ran away with that because I thought this is like a gift for me because it's so interesting, etc. But I, again, have perhaps to put everything in quotation marks, and I think I do that in the book. And lastly, and this is where it became so interesting, the codes of opera are not just musical and verbal, they're also theatrical. So I started to go see operas, and thank you, USC, for paying. And And then I started thinking, I also have things to say about all of these productions. And I do that, for example, in chapter 6, where I talk about a production of Hence's El Cimarrón, based on the Testimonium by Miguel Bernet that I saw in Copenhagen. So I got to go to Copenhagen 2 or 3 times with different reasons to go there. And that's it. So thank you for being here.
I'd like to go ahead and invite Michelle to begin. And thank you so much, Roberto, for your remarks and for this truly beautiful book in every respect.
Thank you, Natania.
I'll jump in. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many faces here to discuss this really, really beautiful book. Roberto, first of all, congratulations on what you've put together here. It's such a work of pleasure. It's extraordinary. It's such a pleasure for the reader to accompany you on this tour that you've taken, this discovery of the world of opera and discovering how to write about it for yourself. And that's really a gift, I think, that you give to the reader afterwards. I come to this as somebody who also works on circulating art forms in Latin America. I work adjacently in dance, and I know very little about opera. And this book has just opened my eyes to so many different forms, so many different forms. Operas about Latin America, operas written from Latin America, works that engage with opera in Latin America. And you teach the reader with such patience and again, such pleasure just to approach these works from so many different perspectives. And yes, I just wanted to begin by saying thank you for this gift that you have given us with this. I have a number of different topics that I wanted to touch upon. I think maybe I wanted to start by saying I was really struck by the way in which you make an argument early on for the fact that opera is never finished and that it always lends itself to restaging, to rereading, to rethinking. And you do this in a number of very subtle and creative ways yourself by going back to the origins of Latin America, the first staging of an opera in Latin America and reading it really against the grain as a Latin American opera. And you talk about this at a certain point as a kind of preposterous mode of dealing with these works. And I think that you, for me, that really opened up ways of looking at these works as works that we need to consider within particular historical context to understand the way that they're resonating, but also to see how those contexts can shift and how these works can become portable. They can be moved and they can move audiences in different places. So I think that you're doing this really beautifully yourself. I wanted to ask you perhaps first about something that I'm picking up on in the title and the subtitle of the book. The title of the book is obviously Latin America and the Transports of Opera. And here you're dealing with so many different notions of transport. So transport is a question of infrastructure, transport in the form of emotional response to opera, the transportability of opera itself, painful histories of enforced transport in the slave trade as well. And you weave all these together in very moving ways. But I'm really struck by the subtitle, Fragments of a Transatlantic Discourse. And I'm struck by the 3 words that are the operative words that are in that subtitle, which I thought you might have actually been choosing for your opening comments. But fragments, transatlantic, and discourse. And of course, resonating behind this is Roland Barthes and Fragments of a Lover's Discourse. Yes. And I think that the lover part is really so clear throughout this book. You say very disarmingly at a certain point that you are perhaps only one space in which these words and sounds, the words and music are resounding very quirkily. And I think that in doing so, I think you're citing something from Beatriz Sarlo's opera about Vittorio Ocampo, where, and I don't think I'll be able to find the quote right now, but she says something along the lines of, yo era solo un espacio donde resonaba la música. And you create so many different, or you turn us into spaces in which this music resonates in I think, really inspiring and generative ways. But I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about this notion of the fragment. You're putting together a kind of a history here. As you said yourself, you're not actually trying to put together a fixed or a frozen history, and you're bringing in so many different times and so many different spaces. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about this question of the fragment and how this was helpful for you in organizing the book and approaching the subject.
Thank you, Michelle, for your kind words and for this really interesting question. And I would start by saying that the use of fragments is a disclaimer, in the sense that from the very beginning, I think I felt the temptation of totality, of perhaps writing a history of Latin American operas, which I couldn't have done, or perhaps a history of European operatic libretti that engage with Latin America, which is closer to my field of literature. But again, it's a huge thing, and I don't have, I think, the knowledge that would go into that. So the idea of fragments, and you know, I mentioned my former professor, Anderson Imber, who wrote Historia de la Literatura Hispanoamericana, and those of you who took classes with him, Veronica, you might remember how he always talked about the obsession of finding the birth dates of everyone that he mentioned in his Historia, and how difficult it was, but time-consuming, etc. So there was no such thing as totality. So I figured I'm going to use that, and it became also very useful because as I wrote the book, new things were coming up that I became interested in. One of the first things that happened was that Thomas Addis, who I think is just an amazing composer, whose work I've followed here in Los Angeles, decided to write an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Tempest. But that came sort of like outside of my timeline. So I figured, well, if it's fragments, I can just do it at some other point in the book, and it became the afterword, actually. But it also has to do with the idea that no opera is complete, as you said. And I think opera is complete when you see it on stage, but it's not the last word either, because as you know, opera fans will discuss forever if any given production is good or bad. And there's this notion also of, you know, trying to retrieve the original production. It's almost like an archaeological impulse that some opera fans have. And it's like, what did Aida look like in Cairo? Or, and I actually do not like those historical productions typically. I am very much, I'm sorry to say, Régie Théâtre person. I love what directors do, even if it doesn't make any sense. But if a director does something that you don't like, then you can say to yourself, but you know, this is only one possibility for the opera. It's not the totality of it. It's not the last word. It's just one of the many things that you can say.
I love that response. I love also the mobility that this grants you, that you can actually then move back and forward between different times, between different spaces, that you yourself can go back and forth across the Atlantic and tracing out these movements. I wonder if I could ask just a follow-up question before heading over to Gustavo, because it also has to do with the fragments and with the question of what do we talk about when we talk about opera, right? Which is probably a question that many of us have coming to the subject. And there are moments in the book where you talk about being interested in the music, but being drawn to the words and being drawn to the question of the stitching together of music and words at times, being drawn to the question of translation as well. You talk really interestingly about the role of different languages and even the attempts in some recent operas to bring in some indigenous languages, for instance, and the challenges that poses even for operatic phrasing, which was fascinating. But into the music, the words, you also talk about the voices. You talk about castrati, the history of castrati and countertenors, and the way that, again, to go back to Barthes, the grain of the voice, right, makes itself felt in the opera and in the interpretation of the opera. And then finally, you make a very interesting move, which is to look at the material packaging of a number of operas by looking at CD covers and CD booklets, which is now beginning to feel like just a moment that flared up, right? A 20-year period when there were CD covers and CD booklets, so that may itself become a kind of historical moment in the history that you're tracing. So could you talk a little bit about that, how you dealt with or how you made the decision to approach these different parts of opera distinctly, and how you found ways of interweaving them?
I think that's a great question, and I think that it had to do with this notion. I think this essential insecurity that I had, that I was not officially a musicologist for sure, nor officially, whatever that means, a scholar of opera. So when you mentioned the Barthes book, the Fragments of an amatory discourse. I like very much the idea of amatory, because one thing that I knew is that I loved opera, but would that make me an amateur?
Yeah.
And there's that risk, and it's not a risk that I completely reject. I mean, I think there's something that amateurs get to say that scholars perhaps do not see. There's kinds of insights that an amateur can have that scholars will see as blind points. But yeah, I needed to deal with all of these different components of opera. And one of the first people that I talked about this book was one of my colleagues here at USC, who has now who left many years ago and sadly passed away not long ago, is Ramon Araluce, who some of you may remember. Lucille, I'm sure you remember Ramon. Ramon, when he told me, "Oh, you're writing about opera," he said, "But what are you writing about?" So I said, "Well, I'm very interested in libretti." And he said, "Libretti? But they're always bad. What matters in opera is the voice." And he kept saying, I remember downstairs here at Taper Hall, "La ópera es canto, canto, canto." And he kept saying, "Canto, canto, canto." And I said, I'm actually, I love singers and all of that, but I'm not an amateur of singers like so many opera fans are. So I just, I think I was just hanging on to anything that I felt gave me some insight into why I thought opera was worth writing about. So the CD covers were absolutely a place that I could express, number one, my love for opera, because I actually started researching opera when there were still shops that you could go to and buy CDs. And you may remember, Michelle, when you were at UCLA, Veronica remembers Tower Records on Westwood, and just a couple of blocks from there, the big Borders on Westwood and Rochester. So I would go there and be fascinated by the covers, and then thinking, what do they reveal about the circulation of opera? So what will prompt an opera fan to purchase La Púrpura de la Rosa? As I think I make clear, and as Luis knows better than anyone, the music of that opera is absolutely fabulous. But it seems that what sells is the image of Frida Kahlo. And you may just dismiss that, but then if you keep thinking about it, it makes absolute sense to have Frida Kahlo there. And I think Frida Kahlo has much to say about Calderón, even though Calderón didn't know her, as much as Calderón has to say about Frida. So I liked those juxtapositions of fragments and how they enriched each other.
I'm going to go ahead and invite Gustavo, with apologies for my use of first names, to intervene.
No apology necessary. Hola, Roberto. Hello, everybody. As I was thinking about this, I think I remember when I first heard about your project, which was like a century ago, sometime in the 1990s, and
Yes.
it was about Mozart's the Mozart aria having shaped the Cuban national anthem. And then when your manuscript came across the virtual doorstep and I read it, I found out that wasn't true, that was a folk legend. And my knowledge of opera, it's sort of like Michelle. I mean, it doesn't go beyond Nessun Dorma and the Cuban national anthem. And now I've lost one of my two, references. But anyway, I wanted to ask you about transports. And there was a sentence in your book, which, by the way, one of the great things about it is that it's a book that's packed with detail, packed with information. It seems like you've read everything, okay? Muy erudito, and yet it's so readable. It's such a pleasure to read, and I don't think that's very easy to do. But anyway, I want to ask about there's one sentence that struck me, and you say somewhere, as opera travels, borders fall. Okay. And I wanted to know whether what is distinctive about the borders shattering power of opera, whether it differs in nature or in quantity from the border shattering effects of other forms of music or of other art forms. You mentioned Frida Kahlo. Well, they're border shattering paintings by Frida Kahlo, by many others. So
Yeah,
why don't we begin there?
that's a great question. And
You don't have to flatter me.
no, hey, listen, but you came up with a phrase early on when I talked to you about my project, which was a bit of a chamber echo, an echo chamber, I'm sorry, because there were all of these voices resounding. So you would have Perucho Figueredo, the author of the Cuban national anthem, along with Mozart, and maybe you would also have I don't know, the Condesa de Merlin, which came from another book of mine. So yeah, but in the case of opera, I mean, as opposed, for example, literature, I think one of the distinctions of opera, it's materiality, the fact that you're immersed in it with your entire body, even if you're only listening to it. And my experience of opera began simply as a listener. I had headphones and I would just lie on my couch and have the voice of Maria Callas in my ears, and it felt almost physical, like I was touching her, like she was in my living room, that she had come back from the dead, and her ashes were spread in the Aegean Sea, and was now here in LA with me. And I guess I'm also very much influenced by Wagner's concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the idea that opera is a complete work of art in which you are bombarded by all of these different codes. The music, which is absolutely it transports you. The stories, and now they have become far more obvious ever since we have supertitles above the operatic stage, so we know what they're actually singing, as well as the magnificence very often of stagings. So I liked the idea of that first production of Aida at the Teatro Colón, where they had Egyptian pyramids. And of course, these were not the real pyramids of Egypt, but they were Egyptian pyramids, perhaps conceived somehow by Verdi and seen in Cairo, but they were not the real pyramids of Egypt. And now they were in Buenos Aires. And you can see all of those Egyptian things taken from place to place. So I guess that's what I mean by the shattering of borders, which I'm sure other kinds of music do. But
Yeah, because I'm transported by Napolitan songs, right? So when I hear somebody sing Cor Ingrato, Chip
Yeah.
Rosselli or somebody, or that me transporta, right? And that kind of music has a far wider reach than opera does, right?
True.
So it would seem to me that because of the extensiveness because of the size of the public that it reaches, it would have a larger border shattering effect than opera, which is, you know, it's really not a bourgeois art, as Adorno says. It's really minoritario, right?
That's right. That's right. In most cultural contexts, it is a minority, an elite art form. I think what opera has that's different from, say, popular Neapolitan songs would be the staging of it. The fact that
The spectacle, yeah.
the spectacle, that's a great word, the theatricality of it. But yes, I think that sentence that you quoted could be extended to other art forms, and especially to other recipients of different art forms, because everyone experiences art in a different way. And I don't want to say, for instance, I don't want to say that you're not transported either by a line in a poem, or the ending of Anna Karenina when you read it. All of these are also things that will move the person reading or listening, etc.
Yeah, and by the way, speaking of theatricality, and I'll stop with this. One of the things I really enjoy about your book is, after you get past the first two chapters, the theatricality of in the presentation of the material, or the operatic quality. Like, I reread of course, the chapter that most interests me is the Cuban chapter, right? And you have, it's like, you know, characters come on stage, and these characters may be books, maybe authors, maybe, you know, librettos. They come on stage and they go off stage. They come on stage and they go off stage. And, you know, that chapter, and I think it would be true of the other chapters, has this great, maybe you want to say spectacular or operatic or theatrical quality that is deliberate, because you use theatrical language, speaking of the succession of characters who come on stage and then exit, right?
Yeah, that's very nicely observed. Thank you. And that chapter 5, for those of you who don't have the book, it's called Havana and the Ghosts of Opera. So it's about, yeah, these spectacular figures that appear sort of momentarily and then disappear from Cuban cultural history. So they are spectacular figures, but also spectral figures. And sometimes what I like about one of these figures is that she may enter as a real life author. That would be the case of of Mercedes Merlin,
Right.
formerly known as the Condesa de Merlin. And then she becomes a character in a novel, in novels by Reinaldo Arenas, as Jorge has studied. And I love that. I love the idea that they are that there's an element of metamorphosis in all of these characters that is very theatrical and perhaps even very operatic. And Merlin especially was this sort of operatic character, who also traveled, as you know, from Cuba to Spain to France, the United States, back to Cuba, back to France. So appears and disappears from different cultural scenarios.
Michelle or Gustavo, if you'd like to ask a final question before I open it up to the audience.
Sure. I wonder if I could pick up on the question of listeners or viewers or audience with this, and ask Roberto to talk to us a little bit more about this. I was really struck in the final chapter by these images of Vittorio Campo listening to opera, occasionally performing herself, writing about this, and the sense that modernity is something that can be staged from the position of the consumer, or the position of the audience. And that this is really the case with so much live performance, particularly in the early decades of the 20th century, the sense that as these new spaces are constructed and as transportation makes it easier for performers to travel between north and south, right, particularly in the off season, as you note, that there is a sudden sense of contemporaneity, right, for audiences in whether they're listening in Buenos Aires or in Paris or in Havana. or in Mexico or in Egypt. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit more about this question of the audience, picking up a little bit as well on what Gustavo was saying about Adorno's notion that opera is a bourgeois art form, which you do engage with, I think, in very compelling ways throughout the book. There are moments when you stop and you ask yourself, but who's actually listening to this, right? What is the audience for it? So can you tell us a little bit about this? What kind of audience reports have you found? What are the press clippings like for some of those earlier performances? Who were the audiences for these operas?
That's a great question, and a huge question too, as you know. There's, for example, one book that I enjoyed very much early on, titled Pasión Cubana por Giuseppe Verdi. And now the name of the author shamefully escapes me. But he goes back to the archives and finds these reviews of opera performances of Verdi. And Verdi was actually an interesting case because Havana was actually a very interesting case because Havana, and this is a well-known fact, nothing that I discovered at all. Havana was the city where many Italian opera companies settled, and from there they would perform in the United States or in Central America. But Verdi was a big thing, and the Italian opera companies were very much in touch with what was being done in Italy. So there are these reviews of how passionate the audiences felt about the materials that they were seeing in front of them. Now, these audiences are as varied as Latin America. True, I guess they would be more elites of different kinds. But then, for example, if you go to Argentina or Brazil, where you have huge numbers of immigrants from Italy and Germany, etc., then the audiences are not necessarily the elite criolla, as Victorio Campo would be a part of. So it really changes. And there is very interesting work, for example, on the Teatro Colón and its fans, the book, The Opera Fan, which is about the people that go to the Teatro Colón and what it means to go there. But I also think that I want people that like opera to feel free to experiment with it in any ways they want. One of the things that I was actually faulted for by one of the early reviewers of the book was chapter 6 that we were talking a little bit about, Michelle, the one on Henze and Gomez.
Oh, yeah.
Henze is, of course, a German composer of the 20th century, writes El Cimarrón, based on the Testimonio by Miguel Barnet. And Gomes is the great Brazilian composer, came a little later than Verdi, but was very successful in Italy and wrote 8 or 9 operas, most of them with Italian language libretti, including the opera Lo Schiavo, The Slave. So what I did there, I felt I needed to speak first of Henze because its connection with Testimonio would allow me as a reader of opera to see things in Lo Schiavo that perhaps might not be that evident. As I wrote the book, I have to confess that I often felt that I wanted to be an opera director and that maybe in my next life, that's what I would like to do, because that would be the best comment that one can make on the opera. So I would love to see a production of Lo Schiavo that took into account Henze's opera somehow. But, you know, I don't know who the audience for that would be. It would not be Adorno's bourgeois, probably. They would not like that kind of freedom to move around.
Thank you all three for this wonderful exchange about such a wonderful book. And I'm going to open up questions to the audience. I might, if I can, pose the first question as you gather your thoughts. Roberto, I was really moved by what I read as the kind of echoes and and sort of ripples of early modernity that pass through your book, which is in many ways a very modern book. And even in your presentation of the book, the corpus and passion as your three organizing terms for today, I heard a kind of pre-modern, a revision of the pre-modern, and in particular, a revision of the pre-modern understanding of both passion and transport as a kind of seizing hold that is both painful and delightful. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about early modernity or pre-modernity and how the opera wraps those two times together.
That's a great question, Natania. I wish that I was a real expert in the early modern. And again, here we have Louise Stein, who is. I mean, the passion and the suffering. One of the operas that I deal with, and this is chapter 4, is Vivaldi's Montezuma, in Italian, Moctezuma. And it's very much an opera about, well, it's an opera about the conquest of Mexico, and therefore it's an opera very much about what was done to that society that lived in Mesoamerica in the 16th century. And it's an opera that starts very dramatically with Moctezuma coming on stage and singing his first big aria, and it's very much the landscape after the battle. So there has been much suffering, but yet you can rise and speak what you have to say. I mean, one of the big questions in opera, especially concerning gender, is the fact that women characters die, is what Catherine Clément famously called the undoing of women. I think there's a bit of that in the character of Moctezuma, who I mean, and I'm getting here into maybe kind of a parenthesis, but Moctezuma is a really interesting case because the music was lost for many centuries. And in 1992, to not celebrate but commemorate the 4th centennial of the so-called discovery of the so-called New World, Jean-Claude Malgoire, a French musician and musicologist, decided to do Moctezuma by using other musics by Vivaldi. And he had actually, what he did is that he had Moctezuma sung by a countertenor, which, at least in my ears, sounds feminine. And I know that there's a big controversy whether countertenors have a male or a female voice. It's a male voice, but it does sound to, I think, most of us like a woman's voice, express all of that suffering. But then, you know, what happens in that opera is that the suffering is sort of alleviated because there is understanding between the characters, there is romance, all of it made up by Vivaldi's librettist, this man Giusti, and all of it also commented by Alejo Carpentier, bajo Alejo Carpentier's character in Concierto Barroco. So I think I'm not really answering your excellent question, Natania, but maybe these are some fragments that people can put together on their own.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I don't want to dominate. I want to, I know, I think it's, thank you so much, Roberto. And Julian, I think, has his hand up. And Daniela, you had your hand up first.
I did, but it was exactly on this chapter. So it's like Roberto, you know, preempted my question. But since we are on it and you said like you're not sure where it was wrapping up, maybe I can very quickly ask you precisely about that chapter, because one of the things that it brought up for me, I mean, as you know, I have a particular interest in Moctezuma and sort of how the history of 16th century Tenochtitlan and the Mexica moves across time. But one of the things that chapter so beautifully brought up for me is that sort of two particular transports, one across time, the historical constant dialogue, because you had this, I wanted almost to chart a diagram of the temporal relationships that you are tracing, right, from Verdi in the 1770s, looking back at, you know, Mexico in 1519 or 1520, and then to the 1990s, and but also geographical, because you compare the staging in Long Beach versus Mexico City, and what it means to stage an Italian opera about the conquest of Mexico in Mexico City. So there were transports across time, there were geographical transports, and there were transmedial transports, right? This sort of constant bouncing back and forth between history, then to opera, then to fiction, then you have Gruzinski writing the letter, like the liner notes. So thinking about Gustavo's question of what is particular about opera, I was wondering if maybe that sort of range of transports, and in particular the transmedial and the role of history as so central to the transports is part of what you are arguing in the book. As you say, you're not a historian, but I am, and that for me was so interesting and important.
That's yet another so interesting question, Daniela. Thank you. This was one of the first chapters that I started working on when I decided to write a book about opera, and the point of origin was the novella by Carpentier, Concierto Barroco. And most specifically, I was fascinated by one little section. And, you know, the novella is about a Mexican criollo in the 18th century who crosses the Atlantic on this sort of grand tour of Europe and happens to arrive in Venice at the time that Vivaldi's composing, about to compose Montezuma. And anyway, so he goes to the first performance of Vivaldi's Montezuma and hates it. He totally hates what he sees on stage, and he comes and talks to Vivaldi and says, falso, 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 todo falso. And of course, this is a provocation by Carpentier, and I think what Vivaldi replies is, la ópera no es, something like along the lines of...
Cosa de historiadores.
Exacto. La ópera no es cosa de historiadores. You know, this is no business for historians. It's business for theater people. But then, you know, I liked that idea, that consideration of falsehood, because it applies to so many cultural constructs, right? I mean, one could at some level say, oh yeah, Concierto Barroco is a novella in favor of historical mestizaje. Because it's all of these mixtures and cultural creations, etc. But perhaps it's not that. Perhaps what literature does is to confuse all of that and say, well, maybe there is no such thing as races. So there can't be mestizaje because we don't have the different ingredients that go into that melting pot called mestizaje. So yeah, and then, you know, this particular opera, the Mexico City production in which certain things are corrected, is fabulous because it just speaks to the idea that opera keeps reviving itself. Each of these corrections denies the death of opera, which, as you know, as opera fans, I'm sure that Rey in Madrid must have heard many times that la ópera está muerta. And then suddenly it revives. So I think that's actually what the freedom that Carpentier views in the treatment of history allows people to do, even to revise it. A historical correction is valid not because it's a correction, but because it's actually a prolongation of the work of art. So there's no archaeological origin in history that we can go to. It's all in the present.
Leon?
Yes, thank you, Natania. Sorry, I think my connection is a bit unstable. I just want to thank you, Roberto, for, I mean, it's been said, for writing such a erudite book and so such a pleasure to read, and it's really a great honor to have you as a colleague, because someone who has worked, who is, a literary scholar and works on a medium and opens up the possibility for other people in the department. So basically, but I just want to come back to Michelle's question, as well as Daniela, the question of transmediality, because it seems to me that opera is also a medium, and the voice is part of the body, right? So it is a very kind of embodied practice that also takes into account the gesture of the singer. So I just wonder if you take into account the mediality of gesture to think about the specificity of opera. And in that respect, I just wonder if you methodologically, if you are thinking about the reenactment of the opera piece as a document itself or as a transformation of the original piece.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it might be both. It's a reenactment in the sense that even if it's a crazy contemporary production where, Wagner's characters are now on the moon, let's say, instead of Scandinavia, that creates a new thing, but the music remains the same. I mean, one thing that is interesting about opera, and I'm afraid that I have not said enough about music, but the music remains the same. So I find it extremely moving, actually, every time that I go to an opera, to see all of these new things on stage, but to know that the sound of it essentially follows a score that is repeated, if you will, perhaps not exactly how it happened at first, and certainly with early operas like La Púrpura de la Rosa, one thing that has had to happen is to have arrangements and orchestrations and so on and so forth. But with many other operas, it's just that going back to that music, that musical gesture, if you wish, that somehow brings back the beginning, but it's also a statement that this is happening right here and now, that it's very much a thing of the present. And with transmediality, I mean, I think here it's so interesting to know that opera has so many new theatrical possibilities. The use of film, the use of other visual resources that were not known before, and perhaps even the freedom from the stage. One of the things, I have to say this too, because when I started writing about opera, people were telling me, but you're in Los Angeles, there's no opera there. You have to go to San Francisco. And it's true. San Francisco opera remains kind of like a bigger, larger, company. But in LA, one of the things that I have seen, that I have been very fortunate to see, is how the medium of opera is being reformed. You may have heard of the company called The Industry, run by Yuval Sharon, and what he does is, for example, let's have an opera that is not in an opera house, but it actually takes place in limousines, traveling from the Bradbury Building on Broadway to East LA, and then to Chinatown, and then you're back in your limo, and two singers get on and they start singing just for you and your husband. And it's like, oh, okay, thank you for this private performance for us. But then you find out that it's being broadcast to some other place where people are not only seeing the two singers, they're seeing you and your husband sitting there being, on the big screen too. So I think this is really the future of opera, to remove it from the traditional spaces. And as you do that, you also bring in new audiences. And it's very rewarding to see it.
There may be time for one short final question, if anyone has a final question. Don't be shy. Yes, Mahmoud?
Hey, how are you, Roberto? Thanks so much for the work. I was fortunate that I read a little bit of it when I was traveling in Latin America, but in Buenos Aires. So when it came out, so it was really great to take a look at it. And like being Egyptian also, so I had this in my mind, like this kind of. But I'm asked, my question will be about translation because like as a translator also, I am super fascinated by this kind of like how to take Aida from Egypt and put it from Cairo and put it in Buenos Aires.
Yeah.
And how it's like inevitable translation. Like you cannot avoid it. Like even if it's within the same medium, it's still a translation.
I think
So
so.
it's another way of thinking about translation, not in this Benjaminian way of like the task of the translator and whatever, but in a different sense. So how do you approach this kind of like thinking of this, performing the same thing within the same medium, but in a different language, in a different context, in a different historical culture,
Yeah.
history? How do you think of this translation?
Absolutely. I think the audience here is really a key to the discussion of the opera. And I actually got into a bit of a controversy early on with a reader who is an amazing scholar of opera. And their point was that Buenos Aires specifically was like Vienna, like Berlin, like any of the other big opera centers of Europe. And my point always was, even if what you have on stage is exactly what you have in Milan, and even if you have an audience composed of Italian migrants and their children, it's still Buenos Aires. And I think that transports me to another space, which has to do with this a border shattering that opera can do at its best. So yeah, it's definitely a food for thought. And speaking of language specifically, what's interesting is that traditionally the opera remains in Italian. So it's an Italian libretto seen in Cairo and seen in Buenos Aires and seen in many other parts of the world. So it's quite stable that
They
way.
tried to translate it into Arabic and it was awful.
I'm sure it can be done nicely too.
I am so sorry to say we have run out of time. We are exactly at time. There's more questions and I'm sure so much more to talk about this wonderful book. Thank you so much to Michelle Clayton, Gustavo Pérez Firmat for joining us in conversation with Roberto. Thank you so much, Natania, for moderating. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation and celebration of Roberto's book. And above all, thank you, Roberto, for your beautiful book. It's such a pleasure to read, and many, many congratulations.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you, Michelle, Gustavo, and Natania for organizing this. And I'm very happy to have seen all of you on screen. So hopefully we meet sometime soon again.